Okay, so we got to this sort of this torii out in that's out in the water. So now click here. Let's take a look at a Shinto shrine at Ise. Okay, so the shrine at Ise is probably one of the most important, if not the most important, Shinto shrine in Japanese culture. Okay, and one of the things that's interesting about the shrine at Ise is that every 20 years it's reconstructed. Okay, every 20 years they build a new one and they tear down the old one. So it's interesting. I'll show you pictures, but they have two adjacent sites, one right next to each other. Okay, and they build it on one side, and the other side gets torn down. The idea is that it's intended to show impermanence. Okay, it's intended to show this sort of continual regrowth. It has this cultural aspect of discipline in that the shrine has to be rebuilt every 20 years exactly the same way. This particular setting, as of its last go around, had been rebuilt 62 times. Okay, and it's a massive structure, but when you compare it and you look at it and you think about it in relation to things like the Pantheon or the Parthenon, it doesn't have that same sort of in-your-face singular character. Okay, here's the site plan that shows the inner shrines, and here's the two sites directly adjacent to each other. All right. So I think I have an aerial image that shows the two sites. Here is again some elevations of the shrine itself and the two alternate sites that directly sit adjacent to each other. So I believe this is a rendering showing the structures on the one site versus the other site. And then here you actually see the two sites in reality from an aerial photograph. And again, every 20 years they get rebuilt. There's one sort of constructed on the opposing side. Another image of the shrine.
In the same site, I'm guessing.
They're on one of the two sites, so it's going to be in one place versus another. So, so that sort of is the most important of the Shinto shrines. Now we move on to Itsukushima, and Itsukushima is a sort of a transitional sort of place because it has a heavy sort of Shinto sort of importance, but it also has a set of structures that are swaying more towards the sort of the Buddhist sort of side in their planning. Okay, so one of the things that's important about this sort of look at things is that once again we're looking at buildings that set into the landscape rather than buildings that stand in contrast to the landscape. Okay. Looking at drawings of this particular setting, we have the torii that is out in the water out here, and it does have an axial alignment to the buildings in here. The central buildings, if you look at them, do have a level of symmetry, okay, that is broken by the position of the things that are directly adjacent to it. So now we'll switch over to sort of Buddhist architecture. So Buddhism came to Japan through Korea from China, right? So Buddhism flowed from China down to the Korean Peninsula, then across the channel into Japan. One of the things that's interesting about Japanese culture is that for some reason they really do not like the. I don't know if you can't say that they don't like it, but there's a. I don't know how to put this politely. The Japanese character in general, not looking at anybody specifically, thinks of itself as more sophisticated and better than Japan and Korea. On the other hand, in general, these are really generalities. The Chinese and the Koreans look at the Japanese as being sort of stuck up. I have some Chinese and some South Asian cultures here. Would you say that that's a fair representation?
Yeah, I think so.
Are you Japanese?
I'm Chinese.
No? You're Chinese. I was looking at Jason behind you. No?
I think the Japanese like kind of sophisticated. It's hard to have a lot of rules. Doesn't make sense. So strict.
What I
Just
noticed
doesn't make sense.
was that the Japanese, when they learned the Chinese culture, they like praised them. That's what I heard.
They did. And then they
And then what?
expanded it and perfected it, and
I thought they still praised them at that point. I didn't know that.
I'm not talking about at this specific point. I'm talking about, as we moved on through history. So there are some. So there's really profound differences. You think about if we look at sort of pottery, okay. And one thing you guys got to understand is that just like with Christianity, right? There are a lot of different sects within Buddhism. Okay, Japan, I believe, is predominantly Zen Buddhists. Okay, which is different than other sects of the religion, and they have sort of different values. But looking, for example, at pottery, right? In Japan versus China. So in China, you're going to find like the finest porcelains. The pottery is going to be ornate. It's going to be glazed. It's going to have images. When you start to look at Japanese sort of the character of some Japanese pottery, it's going to be thicker. In some cases, the pottery is going to be unglazed on the outside and only glazed on the inside. There's going to be this, in many cases, there's a sense of a, not in all cases, but in some cases, a sense of crudeness to the outside that talks about the origins of the clay as being part of the soil. Right? In many cases, you see, the handprint or the fingers or the scrolling of a human hand in making the pottery. That's very, very different than Chinese, where, the Chinese are known for their porcelain. So, different sort of approaches to the same thing. All right? So, taking a look at this, so Buddhism spread throughout Japan in the 6th century, in the 500s. So, some of the most important sites are in the plain of Nara, which served as the capital in sort of the early Mid Ages. So the Buddhist sites are typically identified as temples as opposed to shrines. And when you think of a Shinto shrine, you're not likely to find a library or a temple building associated with it necessarily. Whereas in Buddhism, you are going to see those things. You're going to see a much more sort of profound and larger set of artifacts associated with it than with Shinto. Shinto was much more focused on the spirits within portions of nature. Okay? So different areas sort of in the middle of Japan, different regions where there are a series of temples. Let's see what time we got. We got 3 minutes. So first one we're going to take a look at is Horyuji. And it contains some of the oldest preserved wooden buildings in the world. Okay, so you can see here that there's a whole series of different structures. I've got a map that's going to come up, but you see the pagoda on the side here, and that's not a particularly tall pagoda. Many of these structures even though some of them are very old, have been rebuilt several times over the course of their creation. So here you take a look at sort of the spacing of things inside of it, and you get an idea of the pagoda and the temples that are sort of inside of it. I believe it's also got sort of a monastery that's sort of attached to it. Here you see the plan view of it. You see that there are a series of axial arrangements that are existing sort of within it. So when you start to look at, I believe this is the pagoda, you start to look at it, it's starting to bear a striking resemblance to, you know, the sort of Palladian villa, right? It's got two axes crossing with a center point. It's an object sitting in the landscape. But one of the things about it is that it is it's part of a larger whole.
Thank you.
Okay, so even though, say, that the Pantheon is set in that plaza, it still reads as a singular element. Whereas this, as you walk through it, because of the materials and the lack of permanence of the materials and the design of the surrounding areas, there's a sense of it belonging to its surroundings more so than in the Western sort of architecture. So temple complex layout, the Buddhist temple grounds had several common elements inside of them. One of them was this idea of an entry gate. So I'll back up. Let's see if I can back up. Nope, wrong way. I'll back up and we can kind of get an idea of the temple, the sort of entry gates. You see entry gateway here and the entry gateway there. Okay. And so that was the sort of marker of sorts of entering into this sort of precinct. There was usually this enclosing wall. And part of some of these structures were actually built not originally as temples and monasteries. They were originally built, some of them were built as houses of, I'm going to get this, I will probably get this wrong, but warlords. I think which the shoguns were warlords, or Japanese warlords. What's that? Looking at you know, somewhere between 500 AD and 1000 AD. So in that time period, or 50, you know, up, let's say 500 or 0 through the Renaissance.
Oh no.
Stop. Okay, anyway, so let me kind of get through this thing so we can kind of end on this note. So there's usually a monk's quarters that's associated with the complex. Okay, there's usually a lecture hall, and there could be other buildings to the outside that could be places that are like shrines. In either case, it becomes this complex, okay, that sort of facilitates the religion. And again, you got to bear in mind that as Buddhism started to grow and take hold in Japan, that the monks became sort of powerful. So let's go ahead and stop this here so I can not have a worry about uploading, and we will take a break.